Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, starting oil painting Bird's Eye. Alright, I'm just going to lay down a loose layer of mineral spirits very softly, and then etch in a sort of an islanded mountain peak and clouds. It's going to be slightly fish-eyed, and then we're going to have a bird in flight sort of hanging out above these clouds, looking down.
One of the puzzles for me being in the communication business is how it spreads, how the tree of information spreads, where it's tolerated, where it's repressed, where it's embraced. It's very interesting. You may have noticed mushrooms get extraordinary good press, or none at all. Even in the height of drug war hysteria, the image of mushrooms is largely neutral, unformed in any direction, otherwise viewed as rather comical, harmless, humorous. It is somehow hardwired into our consciousness, connected into an archetype that we are inherently friendly toward as primates. Probably this has to do with this deep food programming that went on for a long, long time. We literally cannot bite the hand that feeds us. So we have a kind of intellectual blind spot to this. Nevertheless, of course, it is a highly repressed Schedule I drug, viewed in the same category as heroin, cocaine, and what have you. This is because it has, quote-unquote, no recognized medical application. You know, I don't know. It depends on what you think of as mental health. I would argue that it's an enzyme for the imagination, without which, as the sign says on the blackboard, you're not yourself. I don't know who wrote that up there, but they must have heard an old tape of mine. This was a graffiti on a wall in Cali, in Colombia. Without this, you are not yourself. Elf, the self.
Please continue to tape 5. Mystic Fire, Video and Audio, proudly presents Terence McKenna. History Ends in Green. This is tape 5 of a 6-cassette series.
I regard this as the freebie lecture that you could sit out if you had a massage, because it's just sort of, it's something which I discovered is one way of putting it, or dreamed up is another. And it's, if nothing else, it demonstrates the slippery nature of ideas. And depending on the audience I'm talking to, I present it different ways. Like sometimes I present it as God's truth. And then like in Austria at this art thing, I presented it as a work of conceptual art. Yes, safer, right? So, and it's a concept, it's an idea that small computers, such as we're looking at, came along just in time, or about 5 years after I first needed them. So I'll just sort of talk about it a little bit and feel my way into it. It's more fun to play with than to discuss the theoretics of. But if you don't, if you don't have some appreciation for the theory, then it doesn't make any sense at all. The basic notion is or the way in which this idea parts company from ordinary science is there is the idea that there is something which has been overlooked in the categorizing of the forces which shape and maintain the cosmos. Something has been overlooked. And I call this something novelty, following Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy as put forth in Process and Reality. So novelty, and one way of thinking of it, if you have a background in Eastern philosophy, is Tao. What we're talking about here is pretty much something like the Tao, but we are going to call it novelty. And it comes and goes in the world according to mysterious and unfathomable rules. And it builds structure up, dynastic families, corporations, nation-states, and it pulls structure down according to some whim or some unimaginable algorithm, or previously unimaginable algorithm. And part of what got me started thinking along these lines was simply trying to make mathematical models of Tao. In other words, taking the statements at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching and taking them as mathematical formalisms and then seeing what the constraints were on a system that operated along those lines. Well, eventually that led me to look at the I Ching, which is sort of the text par excellence relative to this idea that time has qualities. And this idea of the ebb and flow of novelty that I was playing with, I discovered was a notion that was very old in the East. It's not a notion that's even tolerated in Western thinking, because science, in order to do its business, must have the assumption that experiments are time independent. That whether you do an experiment on a Tuesday or a Saturday, this is not a valid parameter of the experiment. However, this idea is suggesting something else. It's suggesting that time actually does have a quality, and that this quality, so far introduced as novelty, and its opposite, and I used to call its opposite entropy, but at Rupert Sheldrake's urging, I now call it habit. So this is a kind of Manichaean cosmology in which habit and novelty are in a constant struggle with each other, one gaining dominance for a period of time and then the other gaining dominance in an endless dynamic relationship. The result of which, over long periods of time, is that novelty is conserved. I think I used this phrase last night in the introductory talk, but without explaining the ideas which lay behind it. But the idea is that from the psychedelic point of view, or from this point of view, the universe is perceived as a kind of engine for producing and distilling and maintaining novelty, and passing novelty on to yet higher states of novelty, each level of novelty somehow allowing the emergence of properties previously forbidden at more constrained levels, so that the whole thing is a bootstrapping process to greater and greater novelty and self-reflection. Well, so that's the basic notion. Then the idea is, following the statement of the Tao Te Ching, that the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way, and following the ideas implicit in the I Ching, that time is a succession of irreducible elements, that time in some way is made of irreducible elements in the same way that matter has been discovered by Western science to be made of irreducible elements. So somehow time is not simply a plenum, a featureless, homogeneous surface upon which the experiments of Newtonian causality can be carried out. But actually, when we look at it at the level, the fine-grained level of experience within the context of a love affair or a dynastic family's rise and fall or something like that, we see then, that it's permeated with qualities. And in the West, these qualities were identified by the Greeks and called fate, and said, to be is to be fate-laden. Somehow the fates impinge on our lives and lead us to our destinies. Science got rid of all this, and then we just had, flying atoms whizzing around in nothingness, leading to some inevitable casuistry dictated by mathematics. Well, okay, I don't want to say too much more about the theoretics of it, but inevitably the question comes up once we get into the wave, where did you say you got this wave again? And the answer is it arose from a fairly stone circumstances, but a fairly dry problem. Meaning, I was quite swept away and in the grip of the mushroom and so forth on a scale of weeks and years, not days. But it posed a conundrum, a koan, a peculiar and confined problem, which was, what is the nature of the order of the King-Wen sequence? Now, background. The King-Wen sequence is a certain arrangement of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. And this particular arrangement is very old, found on shoulder bones, 3,500 years old and so forth. So it was simply asking a formal question. What are the rules which produce the King-Wen sequence? It's always called a sequence. It's always revered as one of the oldest of human abstractions. But what in fact is the sequence? Well, in looking at that, and I won't try to lead you through it tonight unless in a question and answer period some maniac insists. But what it boils down to is that in the King-Wen sequence of the I Ching, there is embedded a fractal algorithm. A fractal algorithm very much like the fractal algorithms that have been discovered in just the past 7 or 8 years by modern mathematics using high-speed computers. But the interesting thing about this fractal algorithm inside the I Ching is that it actually appears to make good on the claim which the I Ching has always been so concerned to make, namely that it was a piece of prophetistic machinery for mapping future time. In other words, that it was a predictive engine for knowing the future. So what I brought out of it, or what I was led to find within it by the promptings of the mushroom genies, was a certain pattern that I was able to mathematically nail to the wall and define. And then all the computer does here is time scale this pattern. And then I will become the devil's advocate for this thing. And I will claim to you that this undulating wave on the screen actually describes the career of novelty in time, in all places, throughout the history of the universe. And we will look at big pieces of time, little pieces of time, and you will quickly get the idea that whether this is quote-unquote true or not, this is some kind of weird heuristic device that has about it the ozone stench of otherworldliness. I mean, it was not thought up by the unaided human mind. There's a kind of seamless completedness to it that marks it not as a discovery or an invention, but as an artifact of some other order. Well, so now let's look at the screen, and if I can come come up with a pointer, and if I can. And I'll show you how this game is played. If the software will cooperate. The software is very good. It was written by Peter Meyer. The idea existed before the software. But before the software, these screens that you're going to see, it took an entire day to make one of them. And it just left you, you know, red-eyed and tremoring, and there was the possibility for hundreds of arithmetic errors.
All right, well, that only took about 15 minutes, so it kind of has a...
the signature. So the invention of small computers in 1977 really opened this up.
nice, loose atmosphere about it. I kind of enjoy that. Sort of looks like a Mario 64 map of Mario Brothers at the moment. But it will be more detailed. But I like where that started. Got kind of an islanded, cloud islanded mountainscape there.
But the main thing you have
All right,
to
I better
see
go
is the
tend to my
line
cat's
of
snacks so
and
she doesn't
I'll
get
try
too
and
crazy.
explain everything
Idle on.
makes sense of it.
Who's an Eidolon?
These are
Idle on the baby
novelty
cat.
units
What are you
along
doing?
this
That's her feed me
axis,
now,
and
you
we never
motherfucker
name them,
face.
but you
That's
can
right.
think of them as
Oh, baby.
escatons or-
It's a baby
or whatever,
Eidolon.
whitehead
Good girl.
on.
Yes, man. It's a good girl.
But this
Alright.
is the important axis, and this is the time
So that starts
axis.
Bird's
Now,
Eye.
what's being
Thank you for
portrayed on
watching.
the screen right
Eidolon and
now
I both
is
wish
6
you a
billion
good night.
years. 6 billion years. In other words,